We're talking today about one of the miracles that Jesus performed. It's recorded in John chapter 6. It's the feeding of the 5,000. You'll remember that Jesus took 5 bread loaves and 2 fish and multiplied them to feed over 5,000 people. In our last vlog, I left you with this question: what evidence do you see that a genuine miracle occurred? Let me share with you how I would answer that question. First, Jesus only started with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and the text tells us that he fed over 5,000 people. So it was a great miracle. Second, I would say that the disciples participated in this miracle. They are the ones who picked up the leftovers. That means they could be called upon to testify about the genuineness of this miracle. And I want you to notice that these men are not biased witnesses. They're not prejudiced. No, just think of Andrew and Philip in this report. Remember that Jesus tested Philip by asking him what they were going to do to feed so many people. And Philip did not express any faith that Jesus could create this great feast. He said, "We don't have near enough money to feed them." Andrew steps forward and says, "I've got this boy's sack lunch, but what is this sack lunch among so many people who are hungry?" So the disciples themselves didn't really believe that Jesus was going to create this miracle, this great feast. They didn't have an inkling of what he was going to do. What this means is that these men are good witnesses. They're not easily led. They're not easily deceived. They're not gullible men. Slow-witted perhaps, but not gullible. Another evidence I see in this text that a genuine miracle occurred is that they end up with more bread and more fish than they began with. The disciples pick up 12 baskets full of leftovers. They ended up with more than they started with. And finally, I see the crowd itself as being witnesses to this great miracle, because the text tells us that they replied, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Now, why would they make such a statement if a genuine miracle had not occurred? Something happened which really impressed them to the point that they could say, Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, as with this miracle, and all the miracles actually, I think the only way to discredit them is to call into question the veracity of the historian. I mean, if we're going to discredit this miracle, we're going to have to call John a liar. We're going to have to say that he's fabricating this account. Now, does it make sense to you that John would fabricate this story? What reason would he have? I think it is a lot more reasonable to conclude that John is telling us what he actually saw and heard and experienced than it is to believe that he himself is a fraud, that he's an imposter, that he's trying to work a lie on the people and make them believe something that is not true. In fact, we know that John and these early witnesses, all of them, were willing to die for their faith in Jesus. They stood by what they said they saw and heard. Now, we know people are not going to give up their lives for a lie. Most often they would say, "Oh, hold on a minute, I made up that story. Don't take it personally, and don't take it for real." No, these were witnesses who were willing to die for what they say they saw and heard. So I think we can trust their reports. Again, if we cannot trust their reports, we're calling them frauds, we're calling them liars, we're calling them imposters, and I don't see any reason to do so. Now, what happened after Jesus performed this miracle? The text tells us that the crowd was ready to kidnap Jesus and force him to become their king. Hey, by the way, this might be an additional evidence that a genuine miracle occurred. Surely they wouldn't take these drastic steps unless their bellies had been filled, unless they had enjoyed this feast that Jesus had prepared for them. The fact that they want to force him to become their king tells us something about the genuineness of the miracle. At any rate, at this point, Jesus sends his disciples away in a boat, and he himself goes to a mountain by himself. Now, Why did he go to that mountain? Matthew and Mark in their accounts tell us that Jesus went there to pray. Oh, by the way, here's a trivia question for you. What is the only miracle that is found in all four gospel accounts, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? You guessed it, this miracle. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle that all four gospel evangelists report. That must mean it's a key moment in Jesus' ministry. But back to my point. Jesus went to the mountain to pray, according to Matthew and John. And what I want to know, which I really don't know, the text doesn't tell us, is why did Jesus feel the need to have a conversation with his Heavenly Father at this particular point in his ministry? Well, at the very least, it tells us about the kind of relationship that Jesus had with his Heavenly Father, the kind of relationship that you and I want to have with God. Well, that's more than enough for today. But I want to return to this miracle because there's still more that we need to discuss about why it was a sign in Jesus' ministry. But before we do, we need to talk about the miracle that occurred immediately after the feeding of the 5,000. And you know what that was? It was the time that Jesus walked on water. We'll talk about that in our next vlog, and that's going to be fun.